When this song was first sung, our fight had just begun, and union maids in the needle trade.
Welcome, everyone. I hope that everyone at least was clapping, dancing, chanting to these awesome songs. We are very excited to have you. We're very excited to have you here today. I hope that you are as excited as we are. Before I get started with the program, just want to go through some housekeeping items. The formal program is for 1 hour. However, we have extended the program for 30 minutes to allow you to interact with our great panelists. You'll be able to ask questions in a question box. And at 11 a.m., you'll also be able to see the report because it's going live then, and we'll drop that in the chat. And then, of course, as you can see, the session is being recorded and we are live on Facebook. My name is Brenda Munoz. I am the Deputy Chair of the UC Berkeley Labor Center. The Labor Center serves as a bridge between the University of California, Berkeley and the labor movement. We conduct research on topics that impact workers and their families, in particular low-wage workers. We introduce students to the labor movement and train leaders in unions and worker organizations to build skills to win better wages and working conditions and to lead their organizations. As you will witness today, we fully support and encourage workers to tell their stories on how they build power. This allows other workers in this country and around the world, people joining us from everywhere today, to be inspired by workers and learn from their struggles. This will help them sharpen and refocus their organizing and bargaining strategies to win. And without further ado, I have the pleasure of introducing Jane Mclavey. I'm sure many of you have heard of Jane through all the great work that she's done in the field and also her books. What makes Jane's work unique is that she has very deep experience in the actual work out in the field. This groundbreaking report today reflects the contributions that she is making as a scholar. Turning the Tables comes directly from Jane's more than 20 years of actually leading workers successfully through contract negotiations using the methods outlined in today's report. In her own negotiations over the decades, Jane has always believed and practiced transparent, big, and open negotiations, as she writes about in the report's introduction. What I personally admire most about Jane is her ability to get people on fire with her energy and unwavering commitment to help workers win. Now, Jane, put us on fire. Please tell us more about your great work.
Thank you so much, Brenda. I think the people who are going to actually set us on fire today are the tremendous workers who are joining us on the panel. And I am so delighted about this report coming to life. And it is coming to life because of some extraordinary work going on in the field, not only in the unions who are featured in this report, and we hope to have many more of these reports, but definitely by the workers in this report. So I want to say just a few things about the report itself. How unions negotiate is a strategic choice. Negotiations between employers and unionized workers are mostly shrouded in secrecy. Seldom do union members experience the actual process of collective negotiations over issues that are crucial, urgent, and relevant to their own lives. The purpose of this report is to discuss how negotiations can be different, very different, from what has come to be the norm. Our hope is to start a robust conversation about collective bargaining, how it is practiced, how it can be improved, and how the practice and process of negotiations relate to power, union governance, and democracy. This report is for unionists, future unionists in particular. We get out there and do our organizing well. Policymakers, labor academics, and anyone else concerned about rebalancing power and battling grotesque inequality, racism, sexism, and more that has become even more rampant during this pandemic. To the extent that there's now any discussion about collective bargaining happening sort of at the national level, the conversation And the policy debates, more often than not, center on something called sectoral bargaining. And by the way, that's exciting. And by the way, it's a very exciting moment that we're having national discussions in this country about unions. What a breath of fresh air in the White House. So sectoral bargaining can be summed up basically as unions sitting down with employers across an economic sector, such as hotels, hospitals, fast food, and retail, and creating standards for wages and benefits. Although sectoral bargaining can be extremely useful in addressing highly fissured supply chains, like any negotiations, it depends. It depends on strong worker organization. And I've been learning this firsthand with a lot of work in Germany in the last couple of years. So its proponents, sectoral bargaining's proponents, point to nations like Germany, where I've been spending a ton of time, and Sweden, where my family is from, and where I also spend a lot of time, where workers have sectoral bargaining. Workers in those countries have sectoral bargaining. While they also have a far better quality of life for workers in those countries, and it looks really good compared to workers in the United States, even in Germany and Sweden, the amazing worker standards are currently under attack, and they're under attack and being eroded even with sectoral bargaining. So in this report, we're going to show a really great example of how workers can build sectoral bargaining from the ground up, from the bottom up. And in 2018, in the Boston hotels, that's exactly what the workers did. They created essentially a floor by creating a citywide, hotel-wide, and actually the Marriott campaign was national. Much the way that auto workers and other sectors of workers did in this country through sheer worker power from the 1940s through the 1970s. So I want to just say, as Brenda mentioned, my entire life as a negotiator and an organizer, but particularly when I began to negotiate contracts, I was trained by my mentors that the more workers who came to negotiations, the better. And it wasn't until I transitioned into what we call right to work for less states in the United States that I went from thinking it was a good idea to have a lot of workers because you can make better decisions with all different kinds of workers in the room. But I went to militantly believing that trying to get almost every single worker we could into the room itself at some point was a way to radically transform the union. And we built a 90% membership plus union in a right to work state. So I think these methods have huge implications for how, in the critical moment we're in today, workers can win more. I'm going to close my opening remarks before introducing Abby and the panel by saying, in my life experience, whether you're in Germany or whether you're in Alabama, the only way, frankly, that workers win a decent life is by building enough power to create a crisis for the employer class. That's the history of how change has been made. And I think we're going to need a lot more of it in the immediate to try and win some more justice, especially coming out of this crazy pandemic. So I want to introduce Abby Lawlor, who is a co-author of mine on this report, who did tremendous work on the case studies, who is an amazing writer, it turns out, not just a great thinker, and has been fantastic to work with. Abby has been what we call a graduate student researcher, working with me on the report throughout. So Abby is a graduate student researcher at the Labor Center, and she's completing her second year in the JD program at the Berkeley Law School. In her prior career, and part of why I think she did such an incredible job on this report, she worked to force bosses and politicians to sit down with hospitality workers at bargaining and policymaking tables as a strategic researcher with Unite Here. That's one of the unions featured in the report. Abby first joined the union movement fighting to get Yale University to pay its fair share to the New Haven community and earned a degree in political science along the way. She is now a proud member of the UAW, that's the United Auto Workers, Local 2865, and Student Researchers United. And I am turning the rest of this over to her and looking forward to the hearing the panel with the workers. Great work.
Thank you so much, Dean. That really means a lot. And I think the crowd that we have here today from unions all around the world and the campaigns that we're about to discuss are such a testament to the value of the work that you've been putting out into the world. And I think the real need for it from all of us who aspire to be better organizers and to pick bigger fights and to win real victories. And I think it's no coincidence that the workers at the LA Times were reading No Shortcuts as they organized their union, or that the field reps at the New Jersey Education Association decided to try open bargaining after hearing you speak. So it's in no small part because you've led by example in your own organizing and negotiating that we now have this set of examples of successful campaigns to share today. And I really hope that our work together on turning the tables will help to ensure that powerful participatory bargaining campaigns only continue to grow. And before we turn to our amazing panel, I also want to say a quick word of thanks to them and to all of the workers and union staff who spoke to me for this report. You took the time to share your knowledge and your expertise in the midst of an unprecedentedly difficult year and tolerated the cognitive dissonance of talking about past victories while also in the midst of profoundly challenging defensive fights to preserve your jobs and your unions. Many of you got off the phone with me only to jump on calls to help coworkers secure severance pay, file for unemployment, negotiate recall rights, and navigate safely performing essential work during a life-threatening pandemic. You all have my deepest admiration and gratitude. Thank you all so much. Without further ado, I'm going to ask our panelists to jump on camera. Our 5 panelists and the campaigns they led mark significant victories over the long 4 years of the Trump administration. And while the bulk of our discussion, I want to focus on how you won and the strategic choices that your unions made that led to success at the bargaining table, I first want to ground that discussion and our conversation in the tremendous victories that resulted from the campaigns that we feature in turning the tables. So Juan, I'm going to briefly introduce you and then turn it over to you to get us started. Juan Eusebio is a DOOR ambassador at the W Boston and a member and shop steward of Unite Here Local 26. He served on a citywide bargaining committee for his union's 2018 negotiations with the largest hotel company in the world, Marriott, which culminated in a very successful 46-day strike. So Juan, I'll turn it over to you to share some of the biggest victories from that campaign.
Hi, how are you? My name is Juan. One of the bigger win we have there was we got a $5 raise for the doorman and bellman because most of our guests don't carry cash these days. And also Uber was created. And so we used to get taxes for the guests, and with Uber, they don't need us. Another victory was the food and beverage language. Any closer chain the company want to make, 90 days, they need to tell us. If during the time we don't agree, in 30 days, we can decide to go and strike in the middle of the contract. I think that's incredible. Before they used to just close and we couldn't do nothing about it and not protect our members. And another one was the implementing technology. The company want to implement anything new, they need to give us 165 days to negotiate. And that's a big key for us to be able to have that. And anything go wrong, they have to pay for a school. Or if we get laid off, we get paid 6 months insurance until we get a new job opening.
Thank you so much, Juan. And it's, I think, really powerful to hear both about the amazing economic gain you were able to make in that contract, but also all of the power that workers gained in terms of being able to strike mid-contract and to have the ability to negotiate over all of these changes that are happening in your industry and in your work. We're going to go next to Donna Stern. Donna is a registered nurse at Bay State Franklin Medical Center in Greenfield, Massachusetts, and a member and statewide leader in the Massachusetts Nurses Association. Donna was a senior co-chair for M&A's 2017 bargaining at Bay State Franklin, during which she and her coworkers held 2 24-hour strikes and were the first nurses in the history of the M&A to be locked out by their hospital. Donna, can you tell us some of the highlights of that contract?
Hi, Abby. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to my fellow panelists. And it's truly an honor to be here with you today. I think the most important thing to highlight as a nurse, the thing that we care about most is patient safety. And what that means is really having safe staffing levels. And so when I think about what we won in our contract, the most important thing we won safe staffing language. We won specific staffing grids for each department. We won language that required the hospital to have minimum staffing. So anytime a nurse left, it was mandatory that nurse had to be replaced. And for us, that was a huge victory, because what led to the fight was thousands and thousands of hours of the same nurses having to work overtime because we didn't have what we needed, which is incredibly dangerous in terms of patient care. So in addition to that, We got back a health plan that the hospital eliminated. We also got a 7.4% wage increase, but to us that was really good. But the most important thing for us was being able to safely take care of our patients.
Thank you so much, Donna. And I know as a result of that language that you won, the bargaining unit grew by 10% at Bay State Franklin because of all of the hiring that resulted from that staffing language. It's really powerful. Next, we'll go to Alex Stevakeris. Alex is a field representative with the New Jersey Education Association, working with local associations in central New Jersey. Since 2017, Stevakeris and his coworker, Jennifer Larson, have been working to transition the local associations that they work with to big, open, or transparent bargaining. Alex, I know you work with a number of different local associations, but would love it if you can share some highlights from their recent victories.
Thanks, Abby. Yeah, as you said, Jen Larson and I work together with several different locals to try to improve their status at the table and also their feelings of self-respect. For the last several years, they were demoralized and beaten down, and we use the concept of open bargaining and maximum transparency to really transform those locals. And 3 of the locals actually began to bring membership into the bargaining process. In the case of, for example, over half of the membership was coming and regularly participating in the bargaining meetings. Sometimes that was up to several hundred members at a time actively participating in the process. And quite frankly, the results were outstanding. The locals got the highest settlements they've had in their recent history. And beyond that, though, the locals were really revitalized beyond the bargaining process. They kept up the transparency model, and now they actually have people who volunteer to participate in activities. They have no trouble getting people involved, and they function like a local should function. So it really has been transformative.
Great, thank you so much. And looking forward to digging in more about how you were able to get so many of those members in the room. We'll go next to Danielle Smith. Danielle is a reporter at Law360 and a member of the Law360 Union, a unit of the News Guild of New York. She served on the unit council during their very hard-fought first contract negotiations and was later elected to the executive board of the News Guild New York. And she starts a new job next week as an organizer with the News Guild. So glad to have you, Danielle, and please tell us, I think, highlights both from your organizing and your first contract win.
Sure. So Law360 is a legal news website. So our unit consists of journalists of all different kinds, reporters, copy editors, etc. And I think there's a lot I love in our contract, but some of the big things I would highlight was our ability to get no quota language in our contract, to secure fair pay for overtime that people worked, and also to establish salary minimums that really brought us up from being, quite underpaid compared to our competitors. And I highlight those things because I think they're particularly important for the media industry, where there kind of is this culture of you're supposed to work really hard, you're supposed to, not get paid a lot, and, you're supposed to pay your dues, not to like a union, but to the industry, before you're supposed to be allowed to, have a living wage or to have work-life balance. And I think, we really rejected that notion, and it showed in how we stood up during our contract fight. And I think it shows in how much the journalism industry has been organizing these past few years. So I think for us, those things were obviously very material life differences, but it was really a culture change in terms of deciding basically that we're going to fight for, the respect and other things that we deserve.
Great, thanks so much. And I'm excited to have 2 of you here from the News Guild, because the work that you're doing, I think, as you spoke to, is really hitting at issues that are systemic in that industry, and the standards that you all set at Law360 and also at the LA Times are particularly inspiring in the context of what's happening in the larger industry. So Christina, turning to you, Christina Bowie is an organizer with the Media Guild of the West and a former copy editor at the LA Times. She was part of the organizing committee behind the LA Times' historic unionization in 2017 after over a century of storied union busting from the LA Times ownership. And she served on the negotiating committee for their first contract campaign. Christina, if you could share some highlights with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. So to start, the LA Times is one of the biggest news organizations in the country. It's probably the biggest news organization in the Western US. And we're representing hundreds of journalists. So I think we really approached our contract campaign as not just an opportunity to lift the standards for our own workplace, but also to really lift standards for the industry, especially at this time of massive cuts to journalism and to journalist jobs. So we ended up ratifying our contract by 388, I think, to 3, which was a big testament to all of the organizing issues we wanted to address in it. Starting with diversity provisions, the LA Times Guild CBA includes a provision where the company is required to interview at least 2 candidates for every guild position from either underrepresented groups or candidates who are women. That was a big deal for us because we wanted to see a more diverse staff. I think Just Cause related to that. Just Cause is a huge priority for people of color, especially in newsrooms, because I think it allows them to speak out against decisions and coverage that they know harms the community that they're from or the communities they're covering. Pay minimums were another huge contract priority for us. We won pay scales that really lifted people's salaries. I think the average raise was something like $11,000 a year for a lot of the members. That was a big deal because it accounted for industry experience and helped close a lot of the racial and gender pay gaps that we saw at the very beginning of bargaining.
Great, thank you so much, Christina. And now we get to actually dig in on the how of how all of you were able to use transparent, big, and open bargaining in order to achieve those really significant victories in your workplaces and in the industries in which you work. So we've set the stakes of the campaigns, and now we're really going to dig in on the strategy and the choices that you all made in order to make those wins happen. So we're going to go back through in reverse order and start with you, Christina. At both the LA Times and at Law360, News Guild members were campaigning for your first contract. And so you got to start from scratch in terms of establishing what those negotiations would look like and setting your coworkers' expectations around the bargaining process. And I would love to hear, Christina, you talk a little bit about the ways in which you were able to establish transparency really early on in your negotiations, and also why that was so important to you and to your coworkers.
It felt really natural for us as journalists. Journalists approach their job with the values of accountability and transparency in mind. The same way that we hold government institutions accountable, we want to hold our own workplace accountable in the same way. So right after we organized, we had our election in January of 2018. Immediately after that, we filed an information request with the company demanding all of the bargaining data that we would need to approach our contract, particularly the salary data. And then we did a massive, months-long analysis of that salary data to figure out where the pay gaps were happening, because we long suspected that there were racial and gender pay gaps, but we needed the data to prove it. And I think putting out that study really helped galvanize the rest of the bargaining unit in understanding what this was all about, in making sure that they understood that transparency was going to be our kind of guiding light from the very beginning. And then from there, we did a bargaining survey with the membership. It was a huge effort because it wasn't just about, sending out a Google form with a list of questions, but also about having a lot of one-on-one conversations and small group meetings to really dig into anything that a Google form just can't cover. And going forward, we really emphasized putting out regular bargaining updates, making sure that everybody knew exactly what was happening in the room at all times, because we figured in the same way that people don't really engage with government and institutions unless they understand those things, they need to be able to engage and understand bargaining. We opened up the room and invited anyone who wanted to join bargaining to feel free to do that. Sometimes we deliberately packed the room, but often it was just, if you want to watch this process up close, you should. And we also did things like hold small group meetings just in the middle of the newsroom so that stewards could be updating their coworkers as bargaining was happening so that management could see us engaging with our coworkers about bargaining just in the middle of the workplace.
Great, thanks, Christina. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more. I know at one point in your campaign, you realized that there was a lot happening in bargaining that HR and the lawyers for the company were seeing in terms of how you and your coworkers were articulating your demands. And then there were all of the actions happening in the workplace that the editors and your immediate supervisors were seeing, but there was kind of a disconnect between the two. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how you were able to not only get members in the bargaining room, but get the editors who were kind of seeing the actions that you were taking in the workplace, how you got them to engage more in the bargaining process.
Sure. I think it is really easy for management to step away from bargaining and say, we're going to let our lawyer take care of this. We're going to let HR take care of this. We're not really involved in that process and those decisions. And so we really wanted to make sure that management understood that this contract was going to be something that they were going to be held accountable to carry out, and that we were going to make sure in enforcing it that they were responsible for respecting it. So we ended up bringing up a lot of our actions happening at editors' meetings. The way the LA Times newsroom is set up is it is a big open floor plan. This was in the before times when everybody was still in the office. And so they would have their editor meetings just in the middle of the newsroom in glass conference rooms. And we wanted to make sure that bargaining always felt very present to them, that they couldn't just silo us off in a conference room on another floor and no one could see what was happening. And so we had people do things like surround the conference room or surround the editor meetings when they were having their A1 morning meetings, planning what was going to go on the cover of the LA Times. Members from the guild would surround them, literally surround the conference table they were at. And we had signs. We lined the halls one day to make sure that when they were walking into that conference room for the A1 editors meeting, they had to walk past all of these guild members wearing their yellow t-shirts and holding these signs that said things like fair contract now. I think it was really about making sure that bargaining felt like an everyday occurrence, regardless of where it was happening or what time it was happening, that they always had to be thinking about it.
Great, thank you so much, Christina. Apologies to our panelists. I'm going to change things up just a little bit to have draw some connections in between the points that Christina just raised. And Donna, I would love to go to you. Christina just talked about how they were able to successfully make their negotiations kind of omnipresent in the newsroom. I think for your campaign at Bay State Franklin, the nurses' contract fight was omnipresent in the Greenfield community, and you were really able to just make it omnipresent in the lives of patients and community members and hospital administrators and your fellow nurses. And would love to hear you talk a little bit about how you're able to do that, and in particular, the choice that you and your coworkers made on the bargaining committee to open up your bargaining to not just all of the nurses at the hospital, but to everyone in the Greenfield community.
So it's important to understand that M&A, my union's history, is that it's open bargaining. Most of the bargaining units, which are hospitals, that has been M&A's philosophy. When I came into union work, I came in as a nurse, and I didn't even understand that there could be closed bargaining and open bargaining. And my natural philosophy is that everything should be open. And so when I learned that this was this is how we operate, I said, thank God, because in order to move forward and anything that you do, especially as a nurse, everything has to be about communication. Just in our work, we have to be able to communicate as a team member. We have to communicate with our patients. And for us, it was just a natural transition to bring that conversation to the table. And because the staffing was so poor and so dangerous, we wanted the community to learn that this is your contract too, that without having safe staffing levels, when you come to our hospital, you and your family, no fault of your own and no fault of our own, you're at risk because the nurses are caring for too many of you at the same time. You have a stake in this. This matters. And so when we set the ground rules from the very beginning, the hospital didn't want anyone present. It was hard enough having fellow nurses who were not on the committee, negotiating committee, but the idea of having patients there and community members there and members of the interfaith group there was horrifying because management's power is in secrecy. Management's power is hiding the message and putting a glossy message forward and making sure no one actually really sees what's going on for them behaviorally. And we said that that was unacceptable, that we would never agree to ground rules that didn't include the voices and the presence of our community members and patients, that this mattered to them just as much as us, that this was their contract too. And so we just refused. We're like, okay, we're not going to agree to that. And it was just so horrifying for them because they're a $2.5 billion corporation, as most hospitals are, and they think they can do whatever they want and treat people the way that they want. And we said, I don't think so. And so that was the line in the sand, that from the beginning, everything was going to be open, everything that we did. So including the outside campaign and the internal organizing, everything was open. But there wasn't one thing kept from members. People knew what was going on if they couldn't be at negotiations, but there were so many different people at negotiations. So they got to see that the union wasn't outside of themselves, that we are the union and the power lies within us. Because I think sometimes nurses feel that they lose their voice, and yet we can't lose our voice. It's life-changing if we lose our voice.
Thank you so much, Donna. And on the topic of Bay State feeling like they could do whatever they wanted, you and your coworkers were the first nurses ever locked out in the history of the MNA. Can you talk just briefly about the role of community support in that moment and how that was facilitated by open bargaining?
We were really, because we had so many community members coming in and out, being present and seeing what was actually happening, seeing how Bay State's behavior, how they treated us. I mean, at the end of this campaign, Bay State had 23 labor violations against them. The National Labor Relations Board basically makes a decision on 6% of the cases nationally. This organization had 23 labor charges. So that tells you what kind of employer we were dealing with. And the community actually saw their behavior, saw how they were treating us, so that when we were locked out, we also did community actions when we were locked out. So one of the days we did cleaning up Greenfield. One of the days we did a food drive. So we turned it into, we may be locked out of the hospital, but we're still taking care of you. And this community matters. So it's the concept of social justice unionism. And it's not a business contract. This is a social contract. This is a soul contract. And so community members were right there with us, including the Greenfield City Council. It was extraordinary because, again, it was open communication, open dialogue. Nothing was ever hidden. And they knew that they could ask whatever they wanted. And it's just this idea that we're in it together, that we're really in it together. And I think people just basically said, you know what, this is our community, this is our hospital. We don't really care how much money you have. We don't care what kind of advertising firm you use. This is our hospital, regardless. But I got to tell you, the lockout was intense. And during the 2 strikes and the 2 lockouts, I was almost arrested 3 different times, including the police putting their hands on me and pushing me out from the hospital, preventing me from going into the hospital illegally. So this was a very, very intense battle all the way around.
I hope in the Q&A and in future questions we can get more into that battle. But Alex, I want to turn to you. Donna just described coming into a long tradition of open bargaining at the M&A, and at the New Jersey Education Association, you were in a different position where the practice and tradition had been a fairly closed bargaining, and you and your colleague Jen Larson made the choice to talk to the leaders of local associations about making a change and opening up the bargaining. And would love to hear you talk about the specific tools that you went to them with in order to make that change happen, and the reaction that you got.
Sure. Okay. That's great. Donna mentioned about power. Jen and I both believe at its heart, bargaining is about power. And the management side has a power, they control the purse strings, but our side has a power that we have people. And that was our goal, to try to get people involved in the process. And up until this point, bargaining in New Jersey is what you consider to be traditional, whereas a small group of people is in a room with management. Maybe you hear some things, maybe you don't, and then there's eventually a deal and you vote on it. And our leaders were desperate for a change because they had been, for the last 8 years, the governor of the state really went after teachers, called them drug mules, emboldened boards, hack teachers associations, education associations, whenever they could, demand concessions, passed laws that reduced their take-home pay by up to $10,000. So our leaders were really desperate to try something different because what was worked in the past wasn't now. So we had, you mentioned Jane's book. We had read Jane's book, and we'd actually done some training on one-on-one conversations and decided to try to leverage that. So we approached 3 locals and said, look, let's try something different. Let's see if we can bring more people into the process, right? Your people are doing, they don't participate in actions when you ask. Let's see if we can bring them into the process. So we did that. And what we recognize is when you talk to people, they build trust, right? They make connections. So that was our foundation of it. So rather than fill out a bargaining survey, we actually set up teams and went and spoke to every member in the local and asked them what was important to them about the bargaining process. What did they want to see change? What thing to get out of it? And it's really funny because that was the first significant finding that we had, was that people who had been in those locals for 20 years had filled out surveys dutifully every time a contract negotiations came around. But when we asked them what was important, they said that was the first time anybody ever asked them their opinion. They never made a connection with the survey as actually asking them. And then we decided to open it up more. And we said, okay, well, we're developing our proposals. Let's bring the membership in to develop the proposals. And we brought them into something that we call a World Cafe. And we invited the whole membership to come in. And we put the proposals out and said to them, hey, here's what we're thinking of proposing to the board. Help us come up with some rationale for these things. You're the experts. You work in the schools. The school board doesn't. We who are at the table may not know your job specifically. Help us develop rationale that we can use at the table to have these proposals adopted. And what that did was that there was a 2-part process to that. The first one was that it showed the membership how difficult it is to bargain. It's not easy necessarily with a rationale for something like that to present to somebody who doesn't want to adopt it. So they started to have some respect for the bargaining team, and then also gave them ownership of those proposals. So now it wasn't the association's proposals. It was theirs. It was their proposals. And we decided to open it up even further. And when we had the first meeting with the boards, we got the board's proposals and exchanged with our proposals. And then we had meetings in every building and shared all the proposals. That was unheard of at the time in these locals. No one had ever seen our proposals, let alone the boards. And the management's reaction was really shocking. They had one place they called the superintendent called the local president and said, why did you do that? If we had known you were going to share the proposals, we wouldn't have put those ones on the table. Well, sorry, then you shouldn't have made that proposal if it's not serious to you. And that's when we decided to say, let's see if we can take this further and move towards open bargaining. So we said, let's invite membership to come and not just see the process, but actively participate in it. So the bargaining team is going to be there, and the people who come are going to be able to help in the decision making. And we thought if we're lucky, maybe we'll get 10 or 15 people show up. And those first meetings, about 100 people would show up. So almost half the locals were showing up to be there and actively participate, which we're doing this on the fly. So it had its own logistical issues. We had to find a bigger room to hold bargaining. We had to all of a sudden bring a microphone so people could hear people talking and so on, and set systems in place so that many members could participate. And it worked out beautifully because every time we had an issue like that, we were able to figure it out and work through it. And all those people participate in the bargaining process. They didn't just get to sit there and watch it. They were there when we would caucus and talk on our own and help decide on counter proposals and whether we accept something or reject it or propose something else. They were in there as a regular part of the process. Something that was really interesting was that we gave them all cards. They had a comment or question, they could have a card and pass it to the end and pass it up to the front to the people sitting directly across from the management. And when the management would say something that they knew wasn't true, 100 cards, 3x5 cards would come flying up to the front that we could use and work right into our presentation. That's really disconcerting for the other side when they know they were caught in a lie right there, and that's what happened. And it's funny, we tried it in 3 locals. The very first meeting where we invited our membership in 2 of the 3 meetings, the board refused to enter the room. They were that intimidated by having to face the people who they made these proposals about, who they were attempting to govern their lives. So, it really just, I couldn't think of one bad thing about it. We had no rumors going on in our locals because everybody knew what was happening. We had, maximum support when they're doing job actions. We started job actions right away because we had the people already organized and on our side because they were engaged in the process from the beginning.
Great, thank you, Alex. And Danielle, we'll go to you next. I know you and your coworkers were coming out of a long fight to get recognition for your unit, and then embarked on what ended up being a 2-year campaign to win your first contract. And would love to hear you talk a little bit more about how you were able to keep your coworkers engaged throughout that 2-year process, and in particular, how you ramped up to actually win an agreement at the end of that time.
Yeah, and so at Law360, we faced a pretty strong anti-union campaign when we went public, but we really came out through that campaign even stronger on the other side. And I think it really actually gave us a lot of solidarity going into our start as a certified union. And I think we entered bargaining very strong and very together. And kind of what happened was we started bargaining, and I was not on the bargaining committee, but basically we did our bargaining survey and we went to the bargaining table with our nice, rational proposals and logical arguments. And then we're surprised when, those logical arguments weren't resulting in agreements. And essentially what we learned very quickly is what everyone has been saying, which is so interesting because we're all coming from these different industries, but this one point remains true. And that's, we realized that everything that we were winning at the table and everything we won in our newsroom was directly tied to our strength and power as a unit and as workers. And essentially, in that regard, having the unit and the workers not be a part of the process just wasn't an option, because that's how we were able to win. So if you want your workers to sort of walk out of the newsroom for something, they have to know what's going on. So we tried to implement several layers of communication. We had our shop papers, which we refer to as the amicus, which is Latin for friend, and it's kind of like a legal pun, where we would give bargaining updates, break down actions we were taking, let people know what the game plan was. One-on-ones were also crucial because email's a great way of communicating. Not everyone reads their emails. So we had to have the one-on-ones, especially when it came to work actions that we wanted to take, getting feedback, making sure people were on the same page. And then those in the office bargaining updates were also extremely crucial in terms of visibility, in terms of showing that, we are all standing together and people are willing, to stop working and go to the front of the office and listen to what the bargaining committee has to say. And at Law360, most of us are based in New York, but we have people in California, in DC, all across the country. So making sure that those remote workers were engaged too was a major part of it as well. And essentially, we basically came up with the plan that we're just going to have an escalation campaign until we get our contract, and just constantly kind of turning up the heat and putting on the pressure and not backing down when we get wins, because wins means it's working. So we just keep going. And that campaign really culminated, I think, in the strike authorization vote we took in October 2018, which involved a tremendous amount of communication, a tremendous amount of planning, and ultimately people voted to authorize a strike 141 to 11. We did other actions around that, including we rallied with Scabby the Rat, which is, the giant inflatable you've probably seen outside. We had an informational picket in front of our office, and ultimately we did not have to go out on strike, but the company knew that we were ready to, and that really, set the tone for getting those last wins and big wins and finishing our contract campaign, which in our contract was ratified, I think it was like 163 to 0, but it was no votes, and we were so excited about that.
Great, thank you, Danielle. And Juan, I know at Local 26 for at least the last 3 contract cycles before the Marriott fight, you all had built up to a strike vote, but had not actually gone on strike. And then in 2018, there was a strike at 7 or 8 Marriott hotels around the city. And also you were not that involved in the union prior to the 2018 campaign, and then became one of those leaders who was taking thousands of workers out on strike. And would love to hear you talk a little bit about what it was in the negotiations process and in how your union was approaching bargaining that brought you into that process and also got you out on the picket line.
So first, I'm going to start from my story, and then I'm going to explain why I'm saying my story. So we used to be, my first year, we used to be non-union, and I was a bellman. I used to get paid $7 an hour. During that time, I was getting paid $7 an hour, but I was a bellman, runner, and houseman during the time. And when I went to ask my manager, like in other places, why I'm doing all this, and they told me it's whatever, whenever. After we began strike and we became union, we sit down with the company, and the company say, "Oh no," then like they never knew that was happening. So that's when I realized I created my philosophy, saying like, in court you don't go without a lawyer. So the same way I say workers should not go without no union in the workplace. And the reason why I'm telling you the story is, so when we started organizing 1 year before we went on strike, what the union started doing is each hotels, we started getting together in the cafeteria, and we all started saying our stories. So each person have a different story. So we all relate to that. So we started doing that in different hotels. So in my hotel, we did that. And then we start making the route smaller. The members decide in each hotel to who's going to lead, who's going to be a leader. So we pick from each department a leader. And then those guys pick a leader from the hotel, which was me in that time. For that, how we make connection was telling a story. And we all relate like, oh my God, similar stories. So we became like a family. Then what we did was we started negotiating with the company and open for the first time in our union. We started negotiating with a company an open bargaining. We used to do closing bargaining. So all the leaders for each hotel that they picked was sitting on the table, but the one all the leader was in the back. So the whole room was full. We used to have the whole union hall or hotel because it was too many people inside.
Oh, Juan, I think you're on mute.
Oh, this whole time?
No, just for a second.
Okay, I'm sorry. So we were all in the hallway all together, and then finally, so that put everybody together. Everything was in the open. We know what we're fighting. Everybody say what they want from the contract. So it was like all 7 hotels against the bigger company, and when it comes to hotel. So when we went on strike, we went to the picking line. We went to the picking line. I remember that, tan, tan, tan. And from far away, I see the Sheraton, the Westin coming, rally, all these people coming to the W. And for me, it was like, wow, like we're going to win this. And then they were coming to the rally, they rally in the W, then we all go together to the wrist. And then, so it was like family, and we were all together. And I think that's the reason why we were able to be successful, because at the end of the day, we have one goal, we all wanted something, we all got it, and we work together like a family.
And that group that came together, it was not just the 7 Marriott hotels, right? But it was 34 hotels across the city of Boston that were all in some way participating in those negotiations. Can you just say very, very briefly in terms of the final settlement, what that encompassed and all of the hotels that impacted?
So yes, this strike was not only against, it was not just against Marriott, it was an industry. We were gonna create a flow for everybody. So everybody was together, because we're gonna make, that's gonna be the contract for the whole city. And what it wasn't in that contract was what I said earlier, technology was very important for us in the future. Food and beverage, they were closing restaurants and we couldn't do nothing. So we put out 90 days and we could be able to go and strike. The wage for doormen and bellmen, because we were not getting cars like before, we bring that up. Also the housekeeping protection for having a button in the room for them to feel safe and anything go wrong, that was big too. So all those things was very important. And I believe, I just want to end with this, this unit is literally from the bottom up. We really everything was created from the bottom all the way up. And when you do that, you're gonna win. You're always gonna win. Thank you.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much to all of our panelists, and thank you for taking the additional time today to stick around and take questions from our audience. I'm going to turn it back over to Brenda, who I think is going to close us out.
Thank you so much, Abby. And to the panelists, we are definitely all on fire. Thanks so much for sharing your stories. And this actually concludes the first part, and actually the formal part of our program. What will happen now is that we're going to drop the link to the report, which is going to be available for you to look at either as a PDF or as a web page. So we encourage you to go there to check it out. And now what's going to happen is Juan, actually, I don't know, Juan, if you're going to stay for 30 minutes, but at least for the first 10 minutes, he'll stay with us. And then the rest of the panelists will be around for 30 minutes. So if you haven't already done so, we encourage you to put your questions into the Q&A box we should see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And then Jane is going to help us look through those and share with the panelists.
Great.
Thanks again, everyone, for joining.
Great. That was an incredible conversation. So I'm just going to pose a few questions that I'm fielding that are coming in through the question box. And then I'll let Abby do follow-up with whoever you think should start and moderate this. The first question that applies across the board is, what decision-making process do open negotiations union bargaining teams use regarding the development of the proposals themselves and the counter proposals? Like, does each person at the table, observers, committee members, et cetera, get to vote on them? Do they vote on the counter proposals? How do you deal with new arrivals and people who haven't heard earlier discussions?
Is anyone chomping at the bit to take that one on? Alex?
Sure, I'll take it on, because we had started that and had no idea how it was going to work. I will say that anybody we had come into our bargaining sessions, we did like a short 20-minute training session with them prior to it, just about the decorum in the room, about being quiet when the other side is in the room, in terms of being respectful of other people's opinions. And again, if they had a question or comment, write it down on the card and pass it up. In terms of the counter proposals and things during the caucus, we didn't know how that was going to go. We were a little worried. I have 100 people in a room saying, how does that turn out? And it was surprising how cordial and smoothly it flowed. We brought in microphones so people could basically raise their hand and add their input on what they thought. And when we started the process, we said, we're going to take your input, but the actual bargaining team, about 10 members, would make the final decision. But very quickly that morphed into a consensus of the room. And it's really interesting how quickly the room will get behind an idea that is a good idea. You don't, the people who you would say maybe would be outliers, or someone would characterize them as a problem member and so on, their voice is very minor in a room where there's a lot of people there all feeling in one way. So very quickly, it was able to coalesce around things like that and to make a counter proposal or a decision. So we opened up and said anybody who wanted to have an input on there, they would. And again, once some people had made comments and other people agreed, not everybody else then felt the need to reiterate that. So it went really smoothly. I was surprised.
Is there anyone else?
Oops, sorry, I'm happy to throw in another question because I think it's probably going to be germane for all of the panelists. And it's the highest number of questions that relate to the same topic is the following. Was it easy to get management to agree to allow all the workers to come into the room? And if not, what exactly did you have to do in order to work with management to make that happen? And there's literally half the questions coming in have basically related to that same topic. I have so much of my own experience, but let's hear from all of you about that.
I can speak to this. It's Donna. Is that okay to speak right now?
Absolutely, go for it.
Okay. We just didn't give them the option. We didn't agree to any ground rules that excluded anybody. We just refused. And we made it, if you want to negotiate, this is how it's going to be. And I think they're not used to that. Basically, they're not used to that. What do you mean you're not agreeing to these ground rules? And we just refused. We said, we're not going to agree to any ground rules that excludes members, patients, community members, or anybody else who wants to witness what's happening here. And so that we just didn't give them the option. Thank you.
Yeah, in New Jersey, the other side can't determine who's on our team. So we said, that's our team. If you don't like it, let's go pound sand. I mean, this is our team. That's the way it is. And they caucus with us and so on. They're not just observers, they're part of the team. So deal with it. There's nothing else. And I had several arguments with board attorneys in the hallway about that. Again, we said, my colleague and I had 2 boards who refused to come into the room. We said, fine, then we're going to move forward without you. And one board actually caved, and the very next meeting, it was more of a collapse. They actually came in and dropped all their proposals and offered a slightly above average settlement just to get out of there. So, and look, that's really empowering to your bargaining team who's been there and been in the process and has been attacked by board attorneys and management when all of a sudden all these people are behind them and they see the other side intimidated.
Yeah, at Law360, we did have the issue where management really put their line in the ground about refusing to hold bargaining in the office where we wanted it to be held so that people could just come in and out during their workday. So we just got really creative about having people, we have a pretty flexible remote work policy. We would just have people work from the union offices. There are many days, I'd type out a story and then run and see what was happening in bargaining and go back out. And then in addition to that, just having the transparency for everyone who wasn't able to be there. And also because journalists, there's a lot of staggered shift schedulings, using that as a way to coordinate having people there. So even when management does I'm always, if they draw a line, I fight it, but get creative if you need to find other ways to get around it.
Okay, I'm going to ask you another question, but this might be a very good time to point out that under US labor law, this is all completely legal and permissible. That hasn't been said yet, and I think, Abby, maybe you want to dwell on that for a minute before I ask the next question.
Sure, it's completely legal to refuse to negotiate ground rules. They're a permissive subject of bargaining, and so it doesn't violate the union's duty to bargain in good faith if you just say no. And so I think, Donna, you gave a really powerful example of just saying no and not working. And I know, Alex, in your campaign, you technically had ground rules, but were able to say, well, actually, our bargaining committee is just the entire workplace, and there's nothing you can do about it. And so, but I think in any case, there's no obligation that unions actually bargain over ground rules.
Yeah, I want to underscore one point, and then I'm going to disappear again and keep fielding you great questions coming from the audience. It isn't just that ground rules are permissible under US labor law, it's that in every country that I know of in the whole world, and this is a debate. Now, I'm doing more and more work with unions across the world. unions have the right to bring whoever you want to negotiations. The employer picks their side under labor law, and the union picks our side under labor law. So that foundational principle, which is barely known to most workers, that you can bring who you want, is a core concept to shifting to big and open bargaining. So I'm going to read one more question and then disappear again, because this is another example of one that says a lot of questions about this. It says, for all the panelists, how did you keep the members updated and engaged after each bargaining session? Who wrote the updates and how did you distribute them? Were they emails? Were they flyers? Were they one-on-ones? Were they small meetings? Please continue to dive into that.
I can answer from the strike side. What we used to do is we used to go to the picking line and tell the member what's going on, because not everybody was in the bargaining, because some people had to stay in the picking line. So we used to send somebody to the picking line, tell them what's going on, everything. And we also have, we used to have a test telling everything about it too, just in case, if we didn't get to see them. So that's what we did for us. And our president also used to go to the picking line for each hotel and talk to each member in person, which was really powerful to get to see him.
Add on to that. Oh, I'm sorry, Donna. I'll be quick.
Oh, please go.
Sure. So we did all of the above. The bargaining committee members would take turns writing the updates. We'd send out an email update immediately after each session. If it were a big update or we wanted management to see it, we would print it out and leave it in break rooms in the newsroom. We would make sure the stewards were having one-on-one conversations. We had pretty regular unit meetings. And we also used social media quite a lot. Social media was super helpful in making sure that, again, bargaining felt really omnipresent, especially for journalists. Twitter is a big place where journalists go and gather and talk. And we knew all of our editors, all of the middle management, they were also online where our members were. And so we tried to make sure that bargaining was very much a thing that they could not avoid seeing in their Twitter feeds or their Facebook feeds.
Hi, everyone. I have to say what the fellow panelists is saying. We did the same. It was really important after every negotiation session that collectively we wrote the update, the bulletin together. And we have unit reps, so the ICU rep, the med surg rep, the ER rep, everyone would be responsible going back to their units, doing one-to-one conversations, updating the bulletin boards. We had a Facebook page, texting, emailing. After every negotiation session, it was plus anybody who was there would also go back and reinforce and have one-to-one conversations. So there was never a time where people didn't know what was going on. And it also made it very difficult for management to try to insert their message or to dilute our message or split our message. It just made it very, very difficult. And we also understood that there were moles. And so it required a discipline in terms of how we conducted ourselves on Facebook. If someone wanted to get into arguments or fights, we would say, thank you so much for expressing your opinion. Here's my phone number. If you want to have further discussions about that, I'd be glad to meet with you face to face. So not to get into these unnecessary arguments on Facebook, because that is a risk of social media. And it's also knowing that that some members, very few, but there are some members who, don't agree and are working with management and have access to all that information. So making sure that the message is clear, consistent, concise, and open all the time. Thank you.
All right, so another question from the many that are flowing in for you says, we are just newly unionized, about to begin a bargaining process. We have a huge need to support marginalized groups who are underrepresented despite the very diverse communities in which we live. I would love to hear more from Christina about some of the contract items you folks demanded and that address this type of issue. And of course, anyone should feel free to answer that, but the question is partly directed at Christina on questions of equity and fairness and fighting racism.
Sure. The first thing I would do is go to those members of those marginalized communities and ask them what are the solutions that they are looking for. But in terms of contract items that the LA Times really fought for, I mentioned the Rooney Rule earlier about looking at hiring data. We also built in a mechanism for accountability to that, where the company is required to provide data from hiring so that we can actually make sure they're following what the contract says. I think also looking at diversity provisions as not just being explicitly about diversity. So often we think of contract language as, an article that says diversity in hiring or protections against discrimination, but just cause is a diversity provision to me because it is about protecting the most vulnerable workers in the workplace. Language around training and professional development, ensuring that people can get reimbursement for doing training programs or for going to conferences to make professional connections and do more education. All of those things are ways of uplifting marginalized workers. I think being creative and not necessarily limiting yourself to the protections against discrimination, all of those things are important.
And other folks should jump in, but Christina, I also wanted to ask, and you brought this up in the victory section as well, can you just give folks a quick definition of just cause and why that's so important?
Absolutely. Just cause means that the company needs to have a legitimate reason for terminating you or for any kind of discipline. Discipline should be proportional to the offense, and it should be, I think, understandable to the person it's happening to, and that's what just cause does.
So I've got a question again aimed at any of you, and it's come in a variety of different ways. And also something I've had a lot of experience with, but I know that all of you have too now, which is, did any of the panelists have moments where reaching consensus among members was really hard, if not impossible? What did you do in those cases, and how did you maintain a united front moving forward? And their variations on the question include, some people have a hard time getting agreement among 10 people. So how'd you get agreement among, hundreds or thousands? So feel free to take at it.
This is Donna. This is a great question. And one of the most difficult things to get nurses to agree to is going on strike, because there's this idea that we're abandoning our patients if we go on strike, and what's going to happen to our patients. And so it required enormous amount of education, open meetings, one open meeting after an open meeting, going to units and going at all different hours, like going at 2:00 in the morning, making sure we're reaching night shift and day shift and evening shift, and talking about what it really means to go on strike and what it means to be locked out. And, making sure we created a strike fund and all of those things, and being really honest. So when someone is afraid, it's not minimizing their fear, it's talking about their fear and then walking them through their fear and basically saying, okay, I totally understand why you're afraid. So let's look at what the worst possible thing can happen. And then let's look at what actually could happen in a positive way if we do this. But that requires so many one-to-one conversations. I can't emphasize enough, nothing replaces one-to-one education. And I think when people see, and I used to go multiple times to people who I knew were really, really afraid. And then what they saw was, wow, we're really in this. We really are in this together. And that we're not doing this by ourselves. We're doing this collectively, and we can support each other. So that's an example of how we got to consensus, over 90% consensus, taking strike votes 2 times.
Yeah, and I would just echo everything Donna said, absolutely. And what I would add is also that when you have open bargaining and when you're communicating in this way, there's also a level of trust that gets built between the unit members and the leadership and the unit members who are leaders, where they can see what's happening at the table and they can see how things have been guided and how things have been going. And so, yeah, having that communication, starting with the small things, is what leads to being able to get consensus about the big things and having the trust that's needed to really take those big steps and actions that get big wins.
Yeah, I agree completely. We did a lot of groundwork beforehand on that, and that communication, ongoing communication is key. The members were there. So, we really didn't, I can't say we had a problem getting consensus. I mean, sometimes took a little longer than others, but it wasn't impossible at all because, as Danielle said and Donna said, it's all those conversations before and during the process that enable it to happen. And when everyone is in the room, group dynamics take over. Again, you can see pretty quickly where the group is willing to go and where they're not willing to go. So it did not take nearly as long as we had thought or had the concerns about.
I just also wanted to add quickly that the best organizers are I just want to say this, the behavior of management also makes it really easy to get to consensus. So when management behaves in a pretty horrendous way, people are like, okay, this is not okay. That moves people pretty quickly to consensus. And when you have everything open and people can see the behavior of their bosses, they're like, oh my God, I had no idea.
All right, so here is another question that's come up several times, and the questions to all of you. Did you prepare or orient workers who have never participated in something like open negotiations and how to do it? Was there role playing? Was there practice sessions? And for some of you, I think for certainly in the case of Alex at New Jersey, it may have represented the biggest change. So you should definitely chime in on that, but I think everyone should.
Yeah, as I said, we did a training session. It's probably 20 minutes or a half hour before the open bargaining sessions would start for anyone who had not already been there. And we established the norms and the rules, that again, you needed to be quiet during when the other team was in the room. When we're caucusing, you need to be respectful of other people's opinions and so on. And, we were very clear that if you disrupt this process, right, you're part of this process now. You are bargaining. You're part of it. If you disrupt this, we're going to warn you and then we're going to eject you. And if it continues, we're going to clear the room and not bring anybody in for the rest of that session because, we need this to go well. We need this to work towards a settlement, towards a contract. And you think about it, those settlements govern your life. It's not just your working conditions. It's where you live. It's where you can send your kids to school. It's your health insurance. It's, your ability to retire. So this is a big deal. So you need to give it the seriousness that it deserves. So that's what we did.
I'd like to second everything that you just said, and also the power of caucus or taking a break. That's a really important tool because if you can see the energy of your group changing, or there's rumbling, or there's a breakdown and decorum, you can call it caucus immediately and regroup and figure out what's going on. But honestly, I don't remember anyone really losing their temper or their patience, except for one time where the management's lawyer was so verbally abusive to us during one negotiation, where there was a nurse a 30-year veteran nurse, stood up and said, enough. And it was so powerful. I have to tell you, it was so powerful. And the room went silent. It was this moment where you cannot verbally abuse us. And we're just not going to take that. But I think there was this idea that was okay to do that. But we had, even before negotiations started, people understood how negotiations worked. And if there were new faces, we would take a caucus and do that, that quick going over how we conduct ourselves and how negotiation works and all of the things that were previously said.
So I'm going to throw out one more question and then begin to transition into wrapping. And the question is, in all of your cases, or each of your cases, again, from the question box here, did you let management know before the first session that this was going to be open bargaining? And how did you inform the management team what your plans were, if you did?
We didn't let them know. We didn't feel the need to let them know. On the first day of negotiations, that's the conversation where management usually says, we want to discuss the ground rules. And then we said, no, we're not agreeing to it. And that was the end of it. But they learned very quickly on that first day, because there were already members there, that members who were senior nurses who had been present and participated in previous contract negotiations. I think management learned that first day that this was not going to be a private negotiation.
All right. So it looks like we have run through so many of the questions that were so exciting. We're so related to one that's just come in. I'm going to ask, and then we're going to start the wrap. The last question that has not yet come up under any of the previous is: do you recommend hiring a professional negotiator, or how do you actually handle the negotiations?
I am a professional negotiator. That's my job. I work for the New Jersey Education Association. So yes, I recommend, if you're a local in New Jersey, I recommend you use your field rep.
In our bargaining, we have guild staff there to assist in negotiations, but it is really important for us and for members, I think, to lead the discussion at the table. So the staff reps are there, and they help with developing proposals and kind of translating a lot of the legalese. But for the most part, we want members to do the talking, because they're the ones who this contract is going to represent and who is dealing with management on a day-to-day basis.
Very similar to what was already said at the M&A, we have what it's called an associate director or field agent, however you want to convert the terminology, where it's really a collaborative project. Together with the negotiating team, together we present the proposals. But I have to say, I'm a nurse, I'm not a lawyer, and there's a lot of legal jargon that, when we have these proposals and it gets converted into contract language. I mean, that's really sometimes difficult. And, management also gets caught up on that language, because it's always who wins the battle for word interpretation. It's really amazing when you think, but every word means something in a contract. Every word means something, but it's a team approach at the M&A.
That's great. So we are about to wrap. I'm going to ask Abby to wrap up the panel right now. And we're going to segue with the last question that Brenda and I are going to talk about, which is, how do you actually transition to doing this? So I would like for Abby to give the final word with this panel about how amazing you have been. And then we're going to turn it over to Brenda.
Yeah, I will just say a huge thank you again to all of you and to your coworkers who spoke with me for this report. I'll also highlight, and Jane may do this again, but your unions were all incredibly generous in sharing materials. So we have examples of effective bargaining updates that these locals used, and the rules of the room that they used to keep their coworkers on the same page, and bargaining surveys and various things that are appendices to the report. So thank you for being so generous in your time and being here, but also sharing those really important resources that people can take advantage of. And with that, I'll turn it to Brenda and Jane.
Thanks, Abby. And I would just echo that again. Thank you so much to Abby and Jane for this amazing work. We're so excited to read the report, but also to the panelists, Alex, Anna, Juan, who's not here anymore, but Danielle and Christina. Really just, you are incredibly inspiring and just really excited to learn so much from your struggles, right? Your challenges on the ground. And I know that everyone who joined us today will take those lessons and apply them to the work that they're going to do moving forward. And like Jane said, I mean, again, you should see the link on the chat. Apologies if that wasn't working earlier. There's a lot of tools there that you actually can download. So I think the first step to that question on how do you move from a traditional bargaining to big open bargaining is read the report, make sure that you download the tools and learn from that. But the other exciting thing is that if you ask, you get, right? Then it will come, is that we are going to be launching a new training on big open bargaining this fall that Jane is going to lead. So we welcome all of you to check out our website, but you also will be getting emails and doing all that great work. And I'm going to turn it over to Jane to talk a little bit more about the training, so you get a little bit of a teaser of what you'll get. Before we do that, I also want to thank actually our Labor Center staff who made this report look so beautiful. And then our tech team and the communications folks, Van and Kirsten, who you can't see, but have done a phenomenal job with teaching us how to do a great job in this webinar. So thanks again for joining us. And Jane, you can close us out.
Thank you so much. So many of those questions, first of all, it was so great to listen to all the panelists actually answer those questions. But I have to tell you on the question of why I think a training program is going to matter is because, because of those 3 little books that I somehow published, which I didn't even realize, I had no life plan to do that. But every time I go and I give a speech somewhere, whether it was NJEA or wherever I am, and I talk about, big and open bargaining as this, to me, fundamental principle of the work that we do. And people say to me, huh? It's usually like shocking to people, right? I mean, for Donna as a nurse in the Massachusetts Nurse Association, which is one of those unions that's just always had this terrific principle that everyone comes. I came out of a local that had as a constitutional rule that every member had a right to be at bargaining. So I also initially, when I was young, thought, oh, everyone in the whole labor movement does this, right? That was my early experience in negotiations. It's like everyone does this. And then I went to work for the National AFL-CIO, right, as a national organizer, and I began to realize, oh, why doesn't everyone do this? And it was a sort of shocking moment for me to realize how few unions actually practice radical transparency. That's the baseline we use for the report, radical transparency. And then we looked for locals who were doing big and open bargaining. Obviously, in all of my books, I talk about this, by the way, in all of them. So, but it's much more important to start hearing from other people who are doing it. And that's the point of this report. And the beauty of the stories that all of our panelists brought to life in this discussion today. So, as Abby mentioned, I want to stress it. There's 2 versions of the report. There's a downloadable PDF. There's also an interactive online web version of the report, and it's extraordinary. So many of the questions that came up from the questions from the panelists and the audience today are covered. People can download the tools, they can look at the negotiations updates, they can look at sample information requests that you want to send to the employer, they can look at what I call the 3 rules of the room when management's in the room, right? I've always used a set of principles about like what we agree to when the boss is in the room versus when the boss is not, when we have freewheeling, great discussions about what we're doing, but then there's a time for when the employer's in the room, right? So the whole report is designed to take lessons learned and actual concrete tools and put them into report. And then stay tuned for our announcement about the first training session this fall about how a local can either transition from a very closed process, which I've had the pleasure of doing with many unions, to how do you start out that way, right? For people who are just forming unions, as we heard from both 360 and LA Times example. So great appreciation to all of you. Abby Lawlor, unbelievable work on this report. What a pleasure. All the work in the field that these unions did Folks should read it, digest it, form study groups on it. It's a terrific report. So I think on that note, we should have a little bit more music from Kirsten, and people can download the link to the report. And we look forward to seeing all of you more in the future and to figuring out how workers win. And it's in part by doing the work that all of you are doing. So great job.